Hello. We're back.
We're back.
That GD show, which stands for Genevieve and Dave, which is funny because we haven't been together here for a couple of weeks. So
I know. Hi.
Good to see you again.
It's so good to see you too. I was gonna say it feels like it's been so long since that GD show was that G and D show. So
yeah.
I've missed you. I love you.
You too. Welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning again tonight. I'm really excited about tonight's show. By the way, I don't know if we've got Call-In Studio up yet. I think we do. We've got a caller on hold, but we'll get that going in a minute. And by the way, like and subscribe. Let me get that out of the way. And call in tonight. You're going to want to talk to our guest tonight. This is a very interesting subject, very important subject. I've already warned a few people that I will probably go on a rant at some point tonight. I'm very passionate about some stuff here that we're going to talk about tonight. So brace yourselves. If we'd love to hear from you. So by the way, call in if you can. What's that number, Genevieve?
That number is 217-375-9933. Please, I put it in the chat. Please give us a call. There's so much going on in the world. I would love to hear your thoughts besides just being stuck in my own brain, thinking about all of my thoughts about how messed up things are. And we will be joined by a wonderful person who has a lot of insight and knowledge and academic prowess to back up her beliefs.
Indeed. I'm very excited to talk with her. Call. Couple of things I wanted to, by the way, if you are a supporter of the show, we appreciate it. If you like what we do here, but not only what we do here, what my work is, the Dying Out Loud work that I do, I think about becoming a Patreon supporter. That would mean a lot. Just so you know, most of you are aware, but I do a lot more than this show. We do a lot of traveling and speaking, and most of the time, the places we go really don't have a lot of budget. So sometimes expenses we're paying expenses out of our pocket, and glad to do it because I really enjoy connecting with people, and it's important to me to get out there as much as I can, as long as I can. So just thought I'd throw that out there. If you're a Patreon supporter already, really appreciate it. You guys mean a lot to us. And there's one of our guys right there, Greg Markowski, $19.99 every week, CTFD. If you don't know, that stands for my motto, Carpe the fucking Diem. And yes, the show was in good hands last week. Genevieve and Ethan filled in as a co-host in my place, did a fantastic job. Daryl Ray was the guest. You guys, it was a great show. I got to watch it after I got back in town. It was super show. As you know, if you're a follower here and a patron here, I wrote a memoir a few months ago called Childish Things. Most of you have gotten that. If you haven't, love for you to pick up a copy. And what we do here is we do a trivia question every week. And so if you're the first one to get the trivia question right, with the right answer in the chat, you win a GD Show mug. There it is. What a beauty that is. You know what? I need to get one on myself. I don't even have one yet. So yeah. But anyway, do you have one, Genevieve? You don't, do you?
No, I don't. I have a GD Show sweater,
okay.
But I don't have a mug. In fact, I was going to ask if I don't ruin it for everybody watching, if I know the answer to the trivia question, can I put it in the private chat? And can you send me a mug? And can you sign it in some sort of permanent marker that won't wash off in my dishwasher? Because if not, hey, honey, Jesse,
We'll work it out.
can you
Hey,
pass me
Jesse.
my copy of that of Childish Things, Dave's book? Thank you. It's right above my bed. So
Oh, say hi to Jesse for me.
I will.
Um,
Dave says hi. Thank you.
yes, yes,
Buy this
we will make sure. But I bet, yeah, I'd love to see you beat the others in the private chat for the answer for tonight's trivia question. To not drag that out any longer, is no cheating, Genevieve. Yeah, actually, you can. It's an open book test.
Thank you.
What happened on Christmas Day, 1999? Oh, she thinks she knows. So, first one in the chat with that answer wins the GD Show mug this week. There's Kim Possible making up for last week. Her donation of $13.32. I missed last week. She normally has that 666 Antichrist donation, so it doesn't. $13.32 is making up for it, but it doesn't quite have the same ring. But thank you for your support. Thank you for your support. Oh, I see some answers already. You guys are good. Okay, without further ado, my God, I've rambled enough. Genevieve, anything you want to jump in with here this before we bring our guest on?
I guess what I would like to jump in on is that, well, A, as we said, miss you. B, Darren White, congratulations, you won the trivia. That was really quick. And C, I don't know if you've seen that video, but a sitting congressperson literally just said that if you are against Christian nationalism, then you are a domestic terrorist. And there is a lot to unpack there as far as what that says about the state of non-believers, the state of evangelical Christianity, what Christianity even means, what it means to be an American. And so without further ado, that is the sort of frustration and confusion and anger that I would like to bring our guest on with. I'm so sorry, Christina.
And here is our guest. Hello, Christina. Christina Lee.
Hi, how are you doing?
Glad to have you with us tonight. You can see Genevieve and I are primed for this subject tonight. And I should say Dr. Christina Lee. So congratulations on your recent doctoral.
Thank you.
Yeah. What is your doctorate in again?
It's in communication studies, and then I specialize in rhetorical studies.
Rhetorical studies. Wow. Well, we're going to dig into that again tonight, and I'm very anxious to. Hello, Janet Moorcroft, 1999. Thank you so much. Play with your pets. Virtual hugs to Dave and Genevieve. That's good advice. And Bill Castle, always there with $10. Thank you so much for your support. Christina, Evan Clark from Atheist United, I think, connected us, correct?
Correct, yeah.
And we began to chat a little bit, and I began to dig in to learn about what your studies are in, and I found it quite fascinating. And so I don't know how to set you up for this, but give us just a brief summary of what it is you've been studying in terms of the Theistnormativity. I love that term in America, the language that's used in America, and what you've found out and what your concerns are. There you go.
Yeah, so I pretty much study the marginalization of atheists, particularly in relation to political rhetoric. And because of what I study, I kind of was forced to start studying Christian nationalism, because you really can't study that without digging into Christian nationalism. But one of the things that I started to notice when looking at particularly presidential rhetoric was the way that they continually talked about US citizens as a theistic collective. So they oftentimes would avoid explicitly Christian language. And this oftentimes gets labeled in scholarship as civil religions, this unifying, vague theistic language that unifies as a religiously diverse audience. But reading through this, it's very obvious that it excludes atheists, and oftentimes in very, very obvious, clear ways. And so I proposed this concept of theist normativity, of kind of the way that within a society, people presume that theism is the norm. But not only that, they tie belief in God to good citizenship.
Right.
So even if there's an acknowledgement that atheists exist, there's this assumption that they're not as ideal of citizens as people who believe in God. So there's several different kind of normative terms that I tend to use. Theistnormativity is the term that I developed, specifically focusing on this kind of notion of, we're God-fearing citizens, we're one nation under God, in God we trust. There's also another term called theonormativity that Kristina M coined, which is more the normalization of religion broadly. And then there's also Christonormativity, which is the normalization of Christianity. And I think they kind of all tie in together, but because I'm so interested in the marginalization of atheists, I tend to focus primarily on the concept of theist normativity.
Now, if you were to use the phrase, the marginalization of atheists, in any cultural setting, any neighbor, go to any dinner party, any backyard around the pool party, and use that, you're gonna get laughed out of the room, right?
I don't usually get laughed at, but I get a lot of very weird looks, and then I have to go into some explanation, and I kind of have some go-to examples. For example, a lot of people don't know that it was as recently as the 1950s, an atheist was denied citizenship in the United States. There are 7 states that currently have in their constitution that an atheist can't hold public office, and even though those are unconstitutional because of a Supreme Court ruling, they're still on the books.
There. It's still there. Right.
Things like juries are less likely to believe an atheist than a Christian in the courtroom. So these types of stereotypes in particular that reinforce these narratives, and really that's a big part of the theistnormativity, is the way that because theism is the norm, atheists oftentimes have to decide whether they want to kind of come out in certain situations, because there's oftentimes this presumption that everyone in the room believes in God.
Exactly.
And you have to decide whether you're going to pass and, bow your head and pray, or just say thank you when someone says God bless you or Merry Christmas or whatever, or not. And so it's these kind of subtle day-to-day interactions in particular that tend to reinforce that.
Yeah. And, it's almost interesting that, just like Dave, just like you said, that it seems like when you say something like theist normativity, that somebody's going to sort of balk and laugh at that. But I think back to my own personal experiences with people finding out that I'm an atheist. And those same people that I think might balk at this idea that atheists are indeed a marginalized community are also the same people that are going to look at me and be like, oh my gosh, do you have a second head? I am looking at you totally different. You are not, and we even see this with, the Boy Scouts are a perfect example of a national organization that doesn't care what God you believe in, but as long as you believe in something, that is a prerequisite for being part of this in-group. It's something that I don't often think about. That I guess what I'm trying to say is that I am surprised that it took this long for somebody to coin this term.
It's beautiful.
But I'm also shocked that it's not something that did not already exist.
Yeah. So there's a theory in communication studies called muted group theory. And part of this theory is this idea that those in power have the ability to develop our language the most. And so oftentimes those who are marginalized don't have language to explain their experiences. So one of the most famous kind of popular examples of this is the term sexual harassment. Of course, people have been sexually harassed for centuries, but that term to explain the experience of primarily women did not really come into our lexicon until the 1960s, even though it's always been happening. And until we had language to put to an experience, it really went unchallenged in our society. And so that's one of the things I really like about coining this term is we can't really address the problem unless we name it. And there's power in naming experiences.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it moves the conversation forward when you give it terminology and language. If you don't, then people are like anything you talk about requires definition. If you say, I believe in God, you have to define what that means to you. It can mean so many different things to many different people. So I love that you're giving language, you're creating language and terms that people can wrap their head around. So thank you for that, Christina. That's incredible work. I want to take a call and then ask you a little bit more about your background. Don't let me miss that. I want to ask you why you got involved in this and what. Hi, Gary Kaminska, 1999. Hi, Dave, Genevieve, and Christina Lee. Dave, I just finished your amazing book. Thank you. And Asexual Atheist, $4.99. Thank you. Rather like all Christians are good people, therefore all good people are Christians. Yeah, that's the battle we're fighting. Let's see if we can get Sheila from Kentucky on the phone. I don't know if my call-in studio is working. It looks weird. No, I got to maybe reload it. I'm going to try that, guys. Genevieve, I know you got something to say. I can hear you. Wait a minute. I got Sheila now. Hang on. Let's get her on. She's been waiting a long time. I think I can take her now. Hello, Sheila. Are you there?
Hi.
Hey, Sheila.
Hi.
Thank you for your
Dave,
patience.
Genevieve, Christina. It's so nice to talk to you guys.
Yeah, thank you for your patience. I know we chatted a bit. I know Sheila and her husband Kamal, they've been through a lot. He just went through open heart surgery and has been recovering and has in Kentucky as atheists in a very, very red state, and the challenges that come with that. But talk to us a little bit, Sheila, about one thing you mentioned in a chat to me about what the God language all around you does to you as an unbeliever.
Well, primarily, it makes me feel really isolated and just separate, alone.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times it feels like a boundary violation. And a lot of times it makes me feel re-traumatized. I mean, I've been trying, it took me decades to break away from religion. And, my grandmother said that there were demons in the house visiting us and sitting on the edge of the bed and different things like that. And so I have this huge, when I start hearing people like talking about religion, sometimes I'm okay with it, but it really depends on what they're saying. And a lot of times it's almost like this re-traumatizing thing, almost like, I know it sounds odd, almost like flashbacks, if that sounds,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Totally understand that. Yeah.
It just kind of feels like it's being pushed down my throat. And then not only that, it's leading to laws that are affecting the way I live my life.
Yeah.
As an atheist, because
that's the big issue. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's the big issue, isn't it, Christina?
Yes, definitely. I think when we talk about Theistnormativity and also the corresponding Christonormativity, which again is you can't really fully separate those two when talking about particularly U.S. context, there is this kind of notion that, in God we trust. So if in God we trust, we must base our policies off of Christian biblical principles, which kind of hints at maybe God's not so vague, like they claim that it is, particularly in legal arguments. And I think it's really important to emphasize that particularly a lot of this symbolism, like under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, for example, that was justified by a member of Congress by arguing that an atheist American is a contradiction of terms.
Right.
And we need to remind people of their theistic nature.
Right.
And so these are meant to make atheists feel isolated and to contain atheism within the United States. So I think that's important to emphasize that is not surprising that people feel that, especially with seeing those symbols, but even in their day-to-day lives, when someone is talking religion to you, and especially if they're assuming that you're theistic and you're having to sit there to struggle, like, do I tell them I'm an atheist and get into this debate and get into, because they're going to ask me why I'm an atheist and I have to relive this trauma. And so it's this constant thing we have to decide in our lives. And there are some days when I'm willing to kind of challenge the Theistnormativity, and there's some days where I'm like, I can't handle this. I'm just going to pass the theistic because I don't feel safe, or I don't feel like I can mentally handle this conversation right now. And it's just a day-to-day battle.
Yeah. How do you handle that, Sheila? Because if you get a family member, I know you had a family member reach out to you about your husband not recovering as quickly because or Christians recover more quickly than atheists from the hospital, just that kind of bullshit. How do you handle those conversations, Sheila, when people impose their theist normativity, the language, the God language on you? What do you do?
I shut down because
Okay.
it's like I'm being punched in the gut, Dave,
Yeah.
honestly. And this is somebody that I love telling me this stuff. And it's kind of like when I was being sexually abused, when I was being raped, I couldn't scream. I just shut down. And that's what happened when she told me this. It's just like it's just this deep fear. You just freeze. You become paralyzed. I know that sounds crazy, but that's.
No, no,
And then
no,
I
no,
got
no.
after it.
It's not crazy. It's very understandable
Not.
because it is an abusive. It's an abusive act on people from people when they insert their belief on you, as though if you don't agree with their belief, you're a bad person or something bad's going to happen to you. They don't mean it that way, but it is very much, as you said earlier, violation of your boundaries. They don't ask for your consent to say those things. They just do it, assuming that you have to take it.
What? And it's like, when I was trying to deconvert, I thought that if I divorced, this is my ex-husband, I married when I was really young. I thought if I divorced him, I would go to hell. And I was
Yeah.
lucky that I actually had a secular therapist and he helped me get out of that. 2 days after I left my ex-husband, I was raped. And I thought, this is my punishment, and it's just like, I don't know. There's just a lot of trauma. And I just wanted to say something to her, but I just froze. And it's just like a lot of times that's how I react. I just freeze. And sometimes I'm able to just kind of, tiptoe around stuff and, say things that I don't know. But sometimes I just get like, I got so angry after it happened that I wanted to say something, but I just couldn't. I just didn't. I just like my whole body froze.
Yeah.
I want to
Well,
that. Oh, go ahead.
no, Christina, I would love to hear your thoughts first.
I was just gonna say, I think that's a very understandable reaction. I mean, I would say even for myself, I don't necessarily have a really traumatic experience when it comes to religion, but I have one relative, for example, who recently I was very anxious to see her because I knew she did not love the fact that I was an atheist. And when she left, she looked at me straight in the eyes and said, "I'm praying for you." Which there's like a level of violence to that when someone who knows you're an atheist says that to you. And it's really hard to explain because it is just words. And I'm someone who studies this all the time. And I'm very privileged in that I am pretty open with my atheism. And I just froze. And that was not nearly as traumatic as your experience
Exactly.
there. And so if I froze in that moment, I can fully understand why someone would freeze in a much more violent response, such as the one that you experienced by your relative.
Thanks for saying that. I really just, it's like I want to beat myself up afterward. And it's like, why can't I just, say something?
So Sheila, what I was going to add to the conversation is that I am somebody who has never had a God belief. I've never been raised in Christianity. I have had atheist parents and have grown up in a very privileged sort of secular environment in which I have only been lauded for my critical thinking and my desire to question all of these things that we take for granted. And yet, as soon as you said that you felt ashamed in any sort of way, as soon as you thought that, oh, am I being irrational by acting this way? I don't even have to think. I'm shaking my hand because of course not. Of course you are not irrational. You have been indoctrinated to believe these things that are deeply intertwined with who you are as a person and your community. It's how you view yourself. It's how you view the world around you. It's how you view your community. And as soon as you heal from that, to then just be sort of pinpricked with this by others who are just diving back into this thing that you've grown beyond, I can only imagine how difficult that is. And I think that your reaction to either, fight, flight, or freeze, either of the three is incredibly rational, and you should never, I don't ever want you to look back on any situation like that and think, oh, I should have done this, oh, I should have done that, because that's should is a terrible word, and the
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
But yeah,
That's the point. It's not your fault that someone imposed themselves upon you and violated your boundaries. Just like we got someone in the chat telling us that Jesus paid for our sins, and if we'll repent, he'll save us. After listening to us talk about boundaries. So there's a perfect example of Christians not respecting anyone's boundaries. And so you don't feel ashamed or embarrassed for anything they do. It's on them. They should be ashamed for imposing themselves upon you without your permission.
And I think this is another really important aspect of this normative aspect, whether it's Christonormativity or theist normativity. But within this culture, to believe in God is the norm. So to express belief in God and to tell people that you believe God and that they should too, that's a kind of, that's considered normal, sharing your belief. But as soon as an atheist says no, or even if they just say, I'm an atheist, please don't do that, it's very quickly turned into, why are you anti-religious?
Yeah.
So that's part of this normativity, is simply disrupting that by saying, I'm an atheist, please don't do that, is viewed as this deviant behavior. And so we're conditioned, I would very much argue, to try to avoid the conflict and kind of blame ourselves when there's conflict, even though that normativity is kind of being pushed on by somebody else with that power of that, and really that privilege.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's also the fear of losing my job, because, every single person, I only know one person in the community, actually two, who are atheists, but it's a fear that they're going to think I'm like possessed by, demons or something, or that I'm evil if they find out I'm atheist, because a lot of people I know believe that. I mean, in fact, when I was a little girl, I had some issues, like I was abused as a child, and I told the counselor, and they ended up sending a minister to try to exorcise the demons out of me. It's like,
God, that's abusive.
It's nuts.
Well, I'm sorry you experienced those things. That's another thing we have to factor in, and I will talk more about that later in the show. Hey, Derek Cruz, thank you. Great show. I know we do have a great show, don't we? Thank you, Derek. $5 super chat. We have the best show on the internet. But we have to factor that. We have to factor that in. People in this country can be, and it's not legal, but they could lose their jobs. They could be demoted. They could be publicly shamed. They could be. I mean, in certain parts of the country, there's a lot of shit that can happen to you if you are out as an atheist. And we've got a lot of work to do to get past that and to move beyond this theist normative life we're living in and world we're living in. It's just it's an uphill climb, but we have to do it. We have to. So I really appreciate Christina helping us get the language that we need to do it.
Yes. And also, Sheila, if I could just offer a little bit of parting advice, if what you are worried about is specifically discrimination, losing your job because of your lack of a religious belief, even in every single at-will state in which you can be fired for any reason, there are still laws against discrimination based off of race and gender and religious affiliation. And so my only encouragement to you to hopefully empower yourself and maybe make you feel a little bit better is that if there is ever a moment when you feel like somebody is saying something untowards or giving you a vibe of any kind that is directly tied to your lack of belief, just make sure to get that in writing and make sure to send an email or write down in text. Just keep a record of this so that even if you live in an at-will state where they can say that you were fired for one reason or another, you can at least have a paper trail that says, prior to this happening, these were the little microaggressions that were faced to me that builds your case to then say that this was indeed discrimination. Because if we do not fight back, then it's just going, people are just going to continue to think that this is okay. So.
Yep. You're right.
Yeah.
Well, Sheila, thank you so much for calling in. Good to hear from you again. And you're doing great. The fact that you have your shit together like you do after coming through all you have is just it's a testament to the strength and power that you have within you. No God needed. So good for you, girl.
All you.
I appreciate it. It was nice talking to you guys. I hope you all have a great evening.
Say hi to Kamal.
All right, I will do. Thanks so much. Good night.
All right. Good night. Bye-bye. She's awesome. They've been through a lot. So, Christina, what got you interested in this? What were you raised an atheist, a Christian? Why are you on this crusade? What's wrong with you? What's your problem?
So I was raised Christian, but I would say I was raised in a relatively relaxed Christian home, in the sense that we were never really tied to a particular denomination. Like, I went to what was called the Federated Church, which was Presbyterian. But I went to every local church's vacation Bible school. My parents were very big on, not saying one religion is the only right religion. My parents, I grew up in a conservative home, but one that still supported secularism. So for me, I kind of started questioning organized religion around 8th grade. And it very slowly was one of those things where I was like, okay, I don't like organized religion. Okay, I still believe in God, but I think the Bible was written by man. Man is sinful. So I don't think it's the literal word of God. And then I was like, maybe I'm not a Christian anymore. I don't think that Jesus is the Son of God. And then I started calling myself agnostic. I think I started realizing I was an atheist. Didn't want to be one. So I went back hard into religion for a little while, started going to church, reading the Bible more, but found myself questioning things. Like, it didn't really help reading the Bible more in depth for me. It created more questions, which I know is a common thing for atheists. And so I finally kind of had this moment where I realized, no, I'm definitely an atheist, and pretending like I'm a theist is causing me more mental harm than just admitting that I'm an atheist. So I started kind of being open about it. I was very lucky that I had a peer of mine who was an open atheist.
Now, how old were you at this point?
I was a senior in college, so about 22, 23.
Okay.
Yep. So I started sharing on my Facebook that I was an atheist, and I never really liked theological debates. So I was always very careful to not attack religion or Christianity or get into theological debates, just kind of say, hey, I'm an atheist, don't believe in God. Did you know that under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954? These types of things. And I was very lucky where, even though my immediate family is all Christian, they are still supportive. I think my mom is watching right now because she's always come into my things.
Oh, hey, Mom.
And so I was really lucky there, but I had some friends who would message me kind of like, why do you hate religion? You're being brainwashed by the liberal colleges. And I was like, this started in 8th grade, not in college. And these types of narratives, which I was really confused by, because I was really careful not to attack religion. I had relatives who would try to comfort my mom by saying, she's going through a phase, things like that I just found really frustrating and delegitimizing. Kind of, these are my sincere beliefs. I came to them for a reason. Ask me about them. Don't just talk behind my back. Also, my mom was great and just tell me when people said things about me, which was always fun. And then one of the really pivotal moments for me, I had two really big things that happened when I started grad school. Because when I started grad school, I actually planned on studying sports communication. I didn't want to get into religion. But I went to
What was your undergrad degree in, by the way?
It was in interpersonal communication.
Okay.
So I was going to be an event planner.
You always have an interest in communication. Okay.
Yeah. Yep. But I went to go register to vote, and the man in front of me went on this huge rant. This is in 2016, about how atheists are destroying America, and we need to say God-fearing Americans need to save. And people looked uncomfortable, but nobody said anything, myself included. And it was kind of one of those similar things where afterwards I was so mad at myself. Like, why didn't I say something? Like, I should have said something. Why did I let this happen? And that was something that really struck to me. And then later I was teaching a class, and I was having my students, we were talking about demographics and I was teaching public speaking. So how we can kind of guess at what our audience's demographics are by just looking at them. So I had them guess my demographics, and they said things like white, blonde, short. And then someone said religious. And I was like, and I'm like, why do you say religious? And he just looked at me so confused. And he's like, I don't know. You just look religious.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, I do kind of look like a Sunday school teacher, so I get that. But so then I had to make a split-second decision of, do I tell my class that I'm an atheist? And I did. And it was very terrifying. I did have a little bit of backlash from one student in that class. I don't know if it has to do with me being an atheist or not, but it was the only time I've ever had kind of a pushback from religion from anyone in a class. So I think it was correlated. So that really kind of struck my interest in this. And I started studying more on religion and how it's talked about in politics. never did anything with sports communication, just got full blown into religion and politics.
Wow.
And again, kind of like I was saying, looking at presidential rhetoric, I was like, I think this kind of normalization of theism kind of explains some of these experiences that I'm having. And I don't know what to call it. It's the normalization of theism, theist normativity. I drew a lot from heteronormativity, things like that. So
I love that. Yeah, I love that. And it's kind of groundbreaking in a sense. So good for you. You really, I think, have struck, I think, something that's at the very heart of what I think it is kind of a foundational undergirding of everything that's problematic with what we see in this country right now, with the rise of Christian nationalism and the stereotyping of atheists and the marginalization of atheists. It's just everywhere, and yet if you try to verbalize that, they look at you, because the Christians try to continue the narrative that they're the ones being persecuted and they're the ones that are on the outs in America. Oh my God, could this be any more opposite?
Yeah.
Seriously.
And this is a lot of what I've just started doing a lot more historical work. And I think, we talk about the rise of Christian nationalism, but I think it's important to emphasize that religious, specifically Christian nationalism, is as ingrained in US culture as patriarchy, white supremacy, heteronormativity. Like, it is we see it in early US rhetoric. There were Christian nationalists who in the 1800s were calling the founding fathers wrong for making the sinful mistake of not putting Christianity in the Constitution. They were trying to pass the Christian Amendment starting around the Civil War, and that's been a thing that's been brought up several times over the last 150 years. And at one point, particularly in early 1800s, particularly at the state level, Protestant Christians had a lot of power in terms of political power in particular. And they did start to lose that over time. They're still by far the most privileged when it comes to politics, but they did lose a lot of that power because of calls for religious equality and tolerance that we didn't see a lot of, unfortunately, in the 1800s. And so I think a lot of contemporary Christian nationalists have this nostalgia for the power that they had in the 1800s, and they view that loss of privilege as persecution when really it's just religious equality.
Well, why is it more in the forefront of our conversations now? I would say in the last 4 to 5 years than I remember it before, where it's this call for this. I think they've had a concerted effort if you look in the background here, but why do you think it's become more on the lips of your average American?
Yeah, and I think this is a great example of history repeating itself. I think it has to do a lot with the advances that secularists have made and the rise of atheism, kind of the normalization to an extent. A lot more people are identifying as religiously unaffiliated, even if they're not using the atheist term. But what we see is a very similar thing happen in the early 1900s, is there was kind of a rise in free thought movement, there was kind of it was kind of the lowest point of secularist atheists or kind of religious norms at that time. And then there was this big backlash where Christian nationalism became a really big thing again in the 1940s and 1950s, which is what there's a scholar named Jonathan Herzog who calls this movement in the 1950s as the spiritual industrial complex. This very intentional move to kind of reinsert religion, specifically Christianity, but they oftentimes would use more vague religious language to make it appear more inclusive, kind of using the Judeo-Christian narrative a lot, and to kind of reinforce this notion that people need to believe in God. So that's where you really start seeing this reinforcement of the theist normativity. And so it was really Christian nationalism, but it was masked in the language of theist normativity to make it appear more inclusive than it really was, because really groups, particularly like Jews, were only included so far as they were willing to oppose secularism. And so I think what you're seeing is kind of a repeat of this. We had another kind of successful surge of secularism and atheism and normalization of that. And this is kind of a retaliation against that.
And so there is a call that I would love to get to, but first off, I almost want to question, like, do you think that at least when I look at sort of like the history of this nation, I do sort of see this like ebb and flow of religiosity, particularly when it comes to Protestant Christianity and sort of like the fervor with which that is sort of pushed on collective society. And I wonder if you think that that is largely reactionary, or if that has sort of been the precursor to the movements that have then like emboldened these people to say, see, look, we have feminists in the 60s and you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination. I highly recommend, one of my favorite historical books is one by a scholar named David Sahet, and it's called The Myth of American Religious Freedom, where he really talks about how we have these kind of two public memories about the US founding, that we were founded as a secular nation and we were founded as a Christian nation, which are obviously very opposing. And he argues that there's kind of a yes and to both, and that when we just presume one of those narratives, we ignore the complexity of the way that these were intertwined, the way that religious freedom was oftentimes denied. And we can't really have a sincere interfaith conversation about what religious freedom and tolerance looks like unless we understand the history of how that has been, how that hasn't really worked out, how our values of religious freedom has not been kind of maintained. And I think, you know, in terms of thinking of the different social movements, these are all so intertwined together. And he does a really great job of talking about kind of, he calls it moral establishmentarianism rather than Christian nationalism, but I would argue that it is inherently Christian nationalism. But he talks about like the role of that and secularism in things like the abolition movement and the women's rights movement, and how they were both happening at the same time. And that we need to kind of recognize that complexity.
That's a good point. Have you read Andrew Seidel's book, The Founding Myth?
I have not finished it, but I have read parts of it. It's really good. Yeah.
Yeah, he's great. He's been a guest on the show. We're going to have him back talking about that. I wanted to get this call too, Genevieve, and then I want to come back to the theistic language embedded in our culture and what we can do about it. Those kind of things. Those are some hot. I'm infuriated about this. So I'm going to rant in a little bit. Hang on, everyone. But let's talk to River in Texas. They, them. Hello, River. Are you with us? Hey, River.
Yes. Hello.
Hello. I'm sorry for the wait. We can't pull out of these conversations, but thank you for your patience. And what would you like to talk with Christina?
No problem.
And
it's a pleasure to listen to.
Okay, thank you. What would you like to talk with us about tonight?
Well, I was listening to the first few minutes of y'all's conversation with, Dr. Christina, and I couldn't help but think about I'm transgender and I'm non-binary, and so I'm on hormones, and so I don't look like I fit into any of the normative categories of human in terms of gender and sexuality. Right?
Okay.
I definitely look like an outsider to those systems and to those normative structures. And I couldn't help but think, listening to this talk about Theistnormativity and Christonormativity especially, and how it seems like the only place I'm not subject to that is in these gender transgressive spaces, in LGBT spaces, especially the T, where it seems like I think a lot of us as LGBT people, I think we have a higher than average probability of having been traumatized and harmed by religion.
Yes.
And I think we have more practice and more understanding when it comes to saying, oh, hey, whoa, these things that are very normal to me or very normal to society at large don't apply here. And trying to apply them here can be very harmful. And so trans and non-binary and gender transgressive spaces are the only places where I'm not really subject to that Theistnormativity. And I just thought this was interesting. And wanted to bring it to the panel.
Thank you. What would you say to that, Christina? Where does she go? I'm sorry. Where do they go to feel free and accepted and normal?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense in that, that particularly the LGBTQ plus community, they're very familiar with this normalization. And I do draw a lot of my work from queer scholarship and the notion of like heteronormativity. And there are a lot of connections between those. And I think that's part of that power of language. Again, even for the LGBTQ communities, that ability to name that normativity was incredibly empowering. And I'm kind of hoping that something kind of similar happens with the notion of Theistnormativity. And it's actually really interesting in some of the work that I've done, people who identify as religious, as well as part of the LGBTQ plus community, have said that they don't always feel welcome there. Like it feels like it's a non-religiously normative space sometimes. So it's a really interesting kind of ebb and flow as to how these different spaces challenge normativity in a different way, and how we just tend to assume that people who look a certain way or have a certain identity must belong into a category of religious or not. So like I'll take my brother, for example, who has their PhD in chemistry. People oftentimes just assume that he's an atheist because of his degree, and he's not. Or somebody who maybe has black hair and nose rings and tattoos, who might assume they're an atheist. But me, a middle class white girl who looks like a Sunday school teacher, people are going to assume that I am theistic. So I think it's a lot of this is, what are our stereotypes of how we just assume that people fit into one category or another, and how do we constantly try to check ourselves and the stereotypes that we're making, and challenging those normative notions.
Yeah. That's the challenge with the Christian nationalism and the ideology behind it. It's not as though, the God language is embedded in our culture, but it's not as though these people are okay with any kind of generic benign God. They have a specific God in mind and a specific faith in mind. And if you don't line up with that, then you're not okay, and you need to be corrected or expelled. And that's the problem with this, because it doesn't make room for the other. Go ahead.
I think that's actually where pulling from queer scholarship and queer theory was actually a stroke of brilliance for this, because it's the same rules for dealing with heteronormativity and cisnormativity, because it's that same rigid structure, that same rigid system of, no, there is a correct way to be. Right. And if you are not that thing, then you are an aberration, and you are not welcome.
Yes.
And so it's very similar in that regard. And it just is interesting to me that I worked at a company a couple years ago that was very, like, all of the top brass was very Christian, very evangelical. Like they had monthly company lunches, and every time the owner would bring in his pastor and for a speech before lunch, and I'm just sitting there, just standing there, and just feeling more and more invisible and more angry. And I was more scared of coming out as an atheist at that company than I was coming out as trans. I was more scared of coming out as an atheist there than I was of coming out as trans. I was more sure that I would lose my job for being a non-believer than I would lose my job for being transgender.
Yeah, that's shocking and disturbing. Well, I shouldn't say shocking, but it is very disturbing. And how would the general public feel? Someone in the chat, there's the thank you, Genevieve, as Azia asked for the call-in number. But how would someone in the general public feel if a Muslim owner had a largely Muslim workforce and had lunches every so often, and had and did the Muslim prayer and put the pressure on everyone? I mean, there would be an incredible outcry in the community if they heard that was going on. but Christians,
I use
it's highly
that very
accepted.
example with.
Yeah.
I grew up in a very conservative environment. This is my first time calling into a live show since I called into Glenn Beck when I was like 14.
Oh my God!
Love to see the growth.
Wow, what two extremes
Growth.
what could be more extreme than that? That's funny.
yeah. But you know, like, oh, what would they say about a Muslim business owner doing this exact thing? That's exactly the example I used with my extremely conservative grandfather when Hobby Lobby was told that they were allowed to decide whether people could have birth control.
Right.
And he said, well, they shouldn't work there if they're not, you know, it's a Christian company, so if they don't want to live by blah, 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 blah. And I looked at him and I said, okay, so if I worked at a halal grocer and I was told that I had to, like, would it be okay if they told me how I could dress and where and what medical care I could have and how I could eat and when my face could be seen? Would that be acceptable? Because, well, it's a Muslim-owned business, so I guess I should be fine with that, right? And he balked.
Of course he
Shocking,
did.
I know.
Of course. Yeah, shocking. You're right. So yeah, I mean, they don't think about that because again, there's that undergirding of the Christian normativity, the Christian normativity that Christina is talking about, that everyone assumes that's okay and that everyone should be that way. And if you step out of line, if you raise your hand and say, wait a minute, I'm not that way, then you're viewed as there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, and I think it's really emphasized, like, you're deviant and you're the one causing problems then. And
Exactly.
so that's really the and it's very similar to, we talked about, like, with the comparing it to heteronormativity of, oh, you're pushing the trans agenda, you're pushing the atheist agenda. No, I'm just saying who I am and that this is a violation of our basic rights. But even just saying that, it is framed as deviant and pushing something, even though you're pushing back against. It's very frustrating.
Well, it's that whole idea that there's something wrong with us because we don't believe in God. That's the problem. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
River. Yeah, and there have been. It's okay. Sorry, this is going to be my last thing, I swear. Okay. There have been like 3 places in my life where I've had that kind of pushback. That why are you rocking the boat? That why don't you just go along reaction. There have been 3 things. Yeah. One has been religion. One has been religion because I grew up Mormon and my mother is still very much in the Mormon church or would like to be more in the Mormon church than she is. And occasionally I had to tell her about something awful in the news about the Mormon church. And the answer so often is, why don't you just drop it? Why do you care so much? The second place that I see that is being a queer person and specifically like wanting to have my pronouns used, wanting to be called my name and not be looked at and treated like the person I used to be and be misgendered and be hurt in that way. And I haven't spoken to one of my brothers in over 2 years because he won't not misgender me. He refuses to even try.
Wow.
And so the reaction from some of my family has been, oh, but you're breaking up the family, River. Why is it really that important? And I mean, yes, it is that important. It's a matter of my personhood not being respected. And the third place, actually the earliest in my life, is when I was sexually abused as a minor. And I didn't want to be around the family member that did it. And I was accused of causing problems in the family.
Mm-hmm.
I was accused of causing problems at Christmas and Thanksgiving and birthdays because I didn't want to be around this man who abused me. And I was told, just get over yourself.
Yeah.
Deal with it. It's not that big a deal. Why are you making it a problem?
Yeah. How dare you stand up for yourself?
how dare I stand up for myself, and how dare I want to be seen as who I am, and treated with dignity and decency.
Yeah. Well, I, for one, am proud of you, because you have shown a lot of courage to stand up and be counted and be yourself and push back against those who would try to force you not to be. So good for you. Keep doing that. Keep doing that. Keep standing up. Keep moving forward.
Thank you.
We have to, all of us have to do that. And I'm gonna talk more about that. I saw Zap Brannigan in the chat mention something I'm going to touch on in a minute about where I think we have to go with this if we're going to move forward as a people, as a country, and not just fall into the cesspool that we've become. But thank you, River, for calling in. Thank you for being who you are, and you keep being strong and being yourself.
Yes. And River,
Thank you so much.
I don't have a criminal record. Let me know if you want me to get one, because I think you've got some people that I would love to meet. I will leave it at that.
I'll have my people call your people.
We'll get in touch. And happy Pride.
Yes, happy Pride. Thank you, River. Thanks for calling. Appreciate you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I was at a party last weekend, just a couple of days ago, and I'm in a community here in Charlotte that with my partner Bevan, and a lot of her friends. I've been meeting them and getting to know them, and they don't quite know what to do with this outspoken atheist activist who's really a good guy, and they're getting to know me and like me, and they go, wow, I don't know what to do with him. They tell Bevan this, he's just great. He's funny. He's smart. He's personable, and he's an atheist. What? How? What? And so I made this comment in passing in conversation at this party. And I said, yeah, I was speaking at the American Atheist Conference a few months ago. And one of them said, wait, what? They have a conference? Atheists have a conference? And I said, yeah. And he said, what do y'all talk about? How bad religion is? I said, well, no, that actually didn't come up much at all. We talk about bad laws being passed. We talk about abortion rights. We talk about things that are important to the people and what's happening in this country. We talk about a lot of things. And I thought later, I thought, would he have had a reaction like that if I'd have said, yeah, I spoke at a Baptist conference? No. I spoke at a dentist conference. Nope. Every group has conferences. Why is there shock that atheists would have a conference?
I mean, if I were there, which I wish I were, I'll hit you up next time in Charlotte. I mean, I would just say right off the bat, I mean, y'all literally have a church on every street corner in every town and every county in this nation. Can we meet like once a year just to talk? But it's that shocking. It is that shocking.
It is that shocking, because that speaks to the bias and the what is thought of when you hear the word atheist, and that people just first of all, that most people don't know what it is. They don't know what it means. They think it's a belief system, or they'll say, you believe there's no God. No, I've never said that. It is not a belief system. It is a lack of a belief. It's exactly the opposite of a belief system. But how do we, Christina, you're giving great language to this conversation. How do we move the needle? How do we go forward as a culture, as a country, as a people?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ones that I focus on the most is I think there's power in interfaith dialogue. And that very thing what you were saying is you have friends who are religious and you talk about what it means to be atheist, and even if you don't out yourself. And I think this is a really important aspect. I think the kind of gut reaction to talking about Theistnormativity is come out as atheist, be open. And I think that, yes, that is a very important way to disrupt atheism, especially if you can disrupt the stereotypes of like, oh, you're a good person, oh, you're doing charity work, this is really weird. But if people have those norms disrupted, that's really powerful. But I think it's really important to emphasize that in a theist normative and Christo-normative society, there is privilege in being able to be an open atheist. And that privilege stems from various different parts of our lives. It depends on, where you live, your job. If you already have multiple marginalized identities, why would you willingly put on another one? So one of the things we'll talk a lot about within the atheist community is why are there so many older white men? People who are retired and don't have the job security or don't have multiple visible marginalized identities are more willing to take on that burden. And that's part of the reason why the kind of open atheist community tends to kind of be that one demographic. And so saying that we should just come out really ignores the danger for some people to be able to do that. I'm very thankful that my family didn't completely kick me out of the family when I came out as not only an open atheist, but someone who actively studies this and does talks like this. And my family faced consequences. The people in my family's church said my parents were bad parents because I was an atheist. My parents no longer go to that church anymore. And so they might blame me, which is fascinating. They're blaming me for taking my family away, but talking about these experiences, saying, hey, like what happened in the church, instead of being angry at people for leaving, be like, what's happening within the church that's making people leave, and having those conversations. But kind of going back to what we can do, even if you aren't comfortable saying I'm an atheist, we can talk about the history of religious discrimination and the history of Christian nationalism and the threat of it. If you support the value of religious equality, tolerance, and freedom, then Christian nationalism is something that you should oppose, because Christian nationalism is the antithesis of that. And so I think having those interfaith dialogues is really powerful, because having, like, for example, my mom, who is still a Christian and tends to vote Republican, fairly moderate Republican, her being able to kind of say, oh, you're saying one nation under God? Fun facts, that was added in 1954. And if I say that, I'm going to come across as anti-religious. If my mom says that, it's a lot more powerful. So I think there's really a lot of power in those interfaith dialogues. Do you want to add something to that?
I was actually going to push back a little, because I've had this conversation a lot, and I've had that position a while, and I may still have it to a degree. But I've begun to believe, because of where we're going as a nation, and what I'm seeing, and this theist normativity that we're living with, until or unless more of us actually use the word atheist, it's going to maintain its stigma. It's going to still be a nasty word, and we're still going to be. Now, that said, I understand that many people will pay a stiff price for that. I myself paid a stiff price for that. I have 2 daughters. One of them doesn't talk to me. I understand that there are some prices to be paid. I saw it in the chat. I can't remember. Oh, Zap Brannigan. I kind of think it's going to take some kind of a revolution, if you will. And there are going to be some people at the front lines of that revolution that will pay a higher price, because, like you think about, I'm picturing like in a movie, and the front lines they're pushing against the army, and the front lines are getting mowed down, if you will. They paid the price for the ones coming behind them to have the way paved a little more. I do believe at some point it's going to take more of that. We're going to have to come out of the fucking closet and quit hiding behind the safety. Yes, are you going to pay a personal price? You might. You really might. You might have some family members that don't like you so much or push back. Most of my family doesn't like me, but I feel it's important for me to be who I am, authentic, and to do my little part to take the stigma away from that word. Some of us have to do it. And I understand what you're saying, Christina, because, and I've always said, and I'll continue to say this, and this is my rant, and I'm almost done. I know that some people there's too much at stake. And I know that. And I'm not telling you, throw caution to the wind. If I had it to do over looking back all those years ago, I probably would have been a little more genteel. with family and friends, and not just, I'm an atheist, don't believe in God anymore, fuck you. You know, it was kind of like, oh shit, you could have toned that down a little bit. So I understand that there's nuance here, and I don't ever want to get away from the nuance, but I do believe that more of us are gonna have to bite the bullet, take the hit, and stand up for just who we are. Just like River said, you know, there is a price to be paid, but there's also a beautiful, beautiful benefit in being able to be authentic and honest in who you are. So it's not so much pushing back; it's both and. I think, Christina.
I'm very
sorry,
glad.
Rant over.
No, that's okay. I love your rant. I also love that I'm sitting, as the camera shows, directly in between you guys, because I would say, Dave, I think that it's important that we do not shy away from using this word, but I would give the same advice to a non-believer as I would to somebody who was in the closet with their sexuality or their gender identity, which is that if your financial security, if your housing security, and if your food security is even potentially at risk,
Yes,
it is not
absolutely.
worth being it is not worth being open and authentic to yourself, because ultimately, at the end of the day, your safety is paramount.
You're right, Genevieve. You're right. I know I'm on her
and
back.
I know you touched on that, and I know that is totally what you believe, but I think that it's just very important.
It's important to say that. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say really quickly too, is that I think that you're also right that we need to be open and honest and comfortable talking about these things. But I also know, if I think back to one of the very first episodes of this podcast that we did when we had Seth Andrews on, I felt a certain amount of kinship with him, because I feel like he and I both sort of took a similar approach in a lot of ways when it came to our neighbors and our community, which was that we were just either the person playing tennis, the person helping you with your yard sale, the person mowing your lawn, and you don't really bring it up, but you develop this relationship with somebody who otherwise probably would have said, oh no, like you are clearly a devil worshiper. You are clearly not somebody that I should ever associate with. If you first let them know who you are as a person, and then it comes out that, oh my gosh, I'm shocked that you don't go to church because you act exactly like I would expect a quote unquote good Christian to act.
Yeah,
then
exactly.
Confronting people with their own cognitive dissonance by giving that space and not putting a big deal on our lack of belief is also, I think, a good strategy. I think it's all of the above. We need to be proud and open with who we are, while also protecting our own safety and mental and financial and just physical well-being, and also not being alienating across the board.
Yeah, and I would 100% agree. I think with the conversation about kind of being an open atheist, we will never kind of reach that normalization unless people are open atheists. So it needs to be if you have the privilege to be open, and I understand there's a lot of like stigma around the word atheist itself. I think there's a lot of history between those in power kind of defining it so that people think of it as communism, un-American, anti-religion, that being able to disrupt that is really powerful. And my kind of what I always say, my goal is that I have no desire to convert people to atheism, but I want to create an environment where people who are questioning atheism feel it's safe to do so. And that's why, for me, I think it's so important to use the privilege that I have to be an open atheist and to challenge those norms. And I like kind of what you're saying is, it is really funny to like watch people be like, but you're such a nice person.
Yeah.
And I have
you look like a Sunday school teacher.
Right.
Yeah, Christina, maybe you need to dye your hair purple and get a nose ring and stuff. You know, take that Sunday school teacher away.
No, I was just gonna say that, like, if anything, like, you know, I know for a long time I didn't have my nose ring, but I pierced it myself when I was 19. I put the ring back in like 2 years ago. Within that time, you know, I'm sure that I often looked like I would be a Sunday school teacher, minus my tattoos that are fairly hidden. But I think that, Christina, somebody like you is sort of one of the most perfect examples of how we can use our privilege that we have, either as white people, as cisgendered people, as heterosexual people, in all of these different ways to show that, no, if you're an atheist, that does not mean that you are like drinking the blood of babies and worshiping Satan, which
Yeah.
I was surprised to hear is a genuine thing that people think.
Exactly.
I grew up with the privilege of a lack of religious
Mhm.
trauma because I grew up with atheists. And so learning that this was sort of the reality of how people saw us was the biggest culture shock.
But you're right. You're right, Christina. Privilege is a good word to use, and that's a good disclaimer. So I think it's very important to dial back a little bit of my raving about this and make sure that you're safe and that you have the good environment to do that in. But as we all agreed, it's going to take more and more people just simply saying, yes, I'm like you. I'm just like you. I'm a tennis player. I'm a neighbor. I take care of my pets. I treat people well. I just don't happen to believe in a God. That's all. That's the only difference here.
And I saw in the chat someone saying that atheists and anarchists are the ones who are talking about kind of the Christofascism and theocracy. And I would actually push back on that. There are a lot of interfaith and specifically Christian groups. Like there's one group that is Christians against Christian nationalism who are fighting against this. So I think that's another point, is that you don't even necessarily have to out yourself as atheist to challenge Christian nationalism.
Right.
I think that's a great way and even to challenge Theistnormativity, to say, hey, like that's a stereotype against atheists. You shouldn't be using that. You don't have to out yourself to still challenge those narratives.
That's true.
So thinking about creative ways to have those conversations that are, again, like, oh, did you know that under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954? Like people's founding fathers believed this. Like, no, they didn't. That was way later.
They didn't.
So challenging that, I think, is really, really powerful. And I will say, I do teach this concept in some of my classes, especially when I teach political communication. And overwhelmingly, I get very positive feedback from my students across the board. My students who are not religious say this is the first time they've ever had language to explain their experiences. And so many of my Christian students say, I can't believe I've never thought of the fact that I have Christian privilege. I've thought about my white privilege. I've thought about my male privilege. I've never thought about my Christian privilege, and I can't believe I never have. So literally just bring it up to them, and they're like, oh. And I'm very careful to talk about this. I'm like, it's not about attacking religion, but it is just recognizing if a value is religious freedom and religious tolerance, how are we failing to live up to that value in a democracy? And that's a great way to start that conversation.
Yeah, that's an excellent conversation. I want to get back to that in just a minute, but we have a caller that I want to make sure we get to. Shiloh, he, him in Utah. Thanks for waiting. Hello, Shiloh. You're on with Genevieve, Dave, and Christina. How are you? I think you're there.
I'm good.
Shiloh.
How are you?
Hey, good. Thanks for calling in. What's on your mind real quick?
Hey, Dave.
Hey.
Just throwing out accolades to your perseverance, and
thank you.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm muddling through the.
It's okay.
I know. How do you? Sorry. I'm also really intoxicated.
Good old fashioned drunk dial.
What?
Go ahead. You were going to say?
Sorry. Hold on. I'm putting up the dog door. Because Patches just gets out and does what he wants.
Well, what was on your mind? Yeah.
How do we as humans get together and change things, I guess?
Well,
because to me,
yeah,
belief is nothing. Actions are what makes us better people, not beliefs.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great point, is really thinking about what our actions are doing. And I think, when it comes to kind of challenging the Christonormativity and Theistnormativity, I think there's various approaches. Some people take a very blasphemous approach of let's disrupt these norms by mocking and attacking religion. And there's power in that, because when you do mock something that has power, it takes away its power. But that also reinforces the negative components. And so there's also a lot of value in thinking about how can we challenge these stereotypes, build human connections, and build interfaith conversations, respecting we don't have to agree on beliefs to agree we are human beings. We support democracy, and we can come together around the things that we agree on. That there is value in that. And it's hard. It's much harder to do than to attack other people. But it's ultimately much better for long term.
Can I interrupt a little bit? But, you know, within the internet, it's easy to mask yourself as something else and then attack.
Right.
When, you know,
Yeah, it is. We can hide behind the anonymity of our keyboards or our phone screens and take pot shots at people. But what Christina was saying, I think what's important is to find the places where we can have interactive conversations, find our commonalities, find the nuance, not stay in our corners firing arrows at each other, but coming together as humans and saying, where can we find that we're more alike than different? And let's build on that.
And in open discord.
Right.
You know, like, you know, I was listening and you know, neighbors. Well, I'm in Utah, so, you know, I had like Jehovah's Witnesses here and Mormons coming next to me, even though I'm not really Mormon, but they're just throwing this stuff in my face. And I'm like, okay.
It's tough. It's tough when you're surrounded by that.
I'll mow your lawn.
Yeah.
Just leave me alone.
Yeah. Well, listen, Shiloh, we got to run because we've got just a little bit of time left. We got to wrap up some things, but thanks a lot for calling, man. Appreciate your support.
You're good.
Okay, buddy. Bye-bye.
Namaste.
All right. Namaste.
Peace.
All right. That was fun.
I love that.
So the language that we're surrounded by and the conversations that we need to have, this is the challenge. I don't know. It seems daunting. I mean, everything from literally insurance companies use language like an act of God. This is what we're dealing with. And while we know it's not in the Constitution that we have to swear on our Bible if we're going to a courtroom, when you don't, you have to push against the norm. You basically have to out yourself to simply be yourself. Yeah. So this is the water we're swimming in. How do we, again, Christina, how do we get there? It seems overwhelmingly daunting.
Yeah. And I'm not going to pretend that it's a very easy task by any means. And I think, you know, we have to be really conscious too of what we choose to challenge. So right now, I would not recommend trying to take a legal challenge to Under God and the Pledge or In God We Trust, because that's not going to win the Supreme Court. But one of the things that if we look at how people from across the political spectrum do tend to support legislation such as In God We Trust bills. So how can we talk about how these In God We Trust bills, for example, are a Christian nationalist campaign, and that is very much what they are. And Christian nationalists are very well aware of this. If they frame these types of bills as kind of easy legislation to pass, because if people oppose it, you can frame it as, why do you hate America? That's our motto. Why do you hate God? And so it makes it easier for them to get to their what they call second phase bills, which are things like Bible literacy courses, which makes it easier to get to their third phase bills, which are things like religious liberty, which is a lot of the discrimination, particularly towards the LGBTQ community type of bills. And I'm pulling this specifically from the organization formerly known as Project Blitz. They've changed their name multiple times, but it's a Christian nationalist campaign. Like, they are trying to do this. And so having this conversation of, hey, let's talk about the history of In God We Trust. how it is it's used by Christian nationalists, how it's not something that our founding fathers were advocating for. Several people in the chat were giving the history of it. I was seeing, and that's really important. And talking to people from across the political spectrum, whether it's Republicans, but particularly Democrats, who do tend to support these types of kind of theist normative civil religion, not explicitly Christian nationalist bills, but are kind of setting the foundation. We can try to prevent those from spreading. And again, I think we've got to be really careful, because it's so easy to twist that critique into, why do you hate America? So really, like, grounding that in history is really important. So I think that's definitely one part of it. I think that notion of, let's talk about what we do know, like research shows that if you are outed as an atheist in the courtroom, you're less likely to be believed. And if you tell someone who's religious that, they're like, oh, seriously? And like, telling people about these and doing this research, there's a lot of study in sociology on this type of discrimination against atheists. And if you can back these up with real stories of people who have been discriminated against, it makes it a lot harder for people to argue that these things are harmless. So that's a really powerful aspect of it. And I think, it's really easy to dismiss these things as just words. Why would we fight this when there's more, like, obviously discriminatory policies being passed? And I understand that impulse, but recognizing that the words that we use shape our culture and make it easier for people to justify different types of legislation. So those words carry weight, particularly in politics.
They do. They're breaking down people's resistance. And I think you make good points about that in some of the articles that I've seen that you wrote. Thank you, Toy Ranch. Glad to see you, Dave. Glad to see you too. The conversations, that's the key. And I love that you've given us language for the conversations, and that's really important work that you're doing. I know that I'm speaking at a conference in Fort Wayne, Indiana. By the way, if anybody lives near there, come. It's June 24 and 25. The conference is called Better. And the idea behind it is, how do we have better conversations between atheists and indoctrinated Christians and people who are stuck in their ways? How do we get beyond the name calling and the punching? I mean, you can see it on YouTube. There's so many YouTube channels that basically are punching down at the stupid Christian videos, and it's such low hanging fruit, and it's so easy, but it doesn't move us forward. It doesn't make the culture that we're living in a better place. And we got to get beyond that. Genevieve, you had something to say.
Christina, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about this, because I think that this black and white thinking that I have seen from the atheist community, I think that is also just a product of this theist normative ideology. It's like, when I think something that I often think about, because I have, outside of just being a secular activist, I've been an activist in many different realms, as far as human rights or anti-racism or sexism. And one thing that we always go back to is that it all has to do with intersectionality. And I think that on the right, or at least on the systems that we are often fighting against that are causing these problems when it comes to equality and understanding, it does come back to Christianity and sort of like these founding ideals of this nation. And so when I think that when we think of these issues in a very like narrow-minded black and white sort of thinking, I think that it can be helpful to remind other atheists or non-believers who are focusing their anger on one point instead of looking at the larger picture, or even like broadening our coalition of people who agree largely on these fundamentals that make the entirety of society more equal across the board, regardless of your religious beliefs or non-beliefs. I often think that framing it that way and understanding that this sort of black and white good and evil thinking is something that does come directly from this belief in all of this. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think so one of the things we talk about a lot of times in political rhetoric classes is the notion of, we live in a very demagogic society, unfortunately, where people kind of divide us to us, them, good, evil, your party versus my party, Christian versus atheist, whatever it is. And, we're always right, you're always wrong. we have good intentions, you have bad intentions.
Right.
And that is, and anytime democracy falls, demagoguery comes first. Demagoguery doesn't always lead to the fall of democracy, but it's not a great thing to have. And one of the values and important aspects of democracy is that disagreement should be celebrated. Because if there's not disagreement, then you probably don't have democracy.
Exactly.
So I think there's this value of recognizing, I am, as an atheist who is opposed to Christian nationalism, I am never going to convince these like really hardcore Christian nationalist ambassadors. I'm not going to change their mind easily. That would be a very long, slow process where they're going to need to transition to being a little bit less intense. But I can help maybe get them there with these kind of subtle aspects. But more importantly, I can focus on the people who there's some scholars named Whitehead and Perry, and I can't think of their first names right now, but they wrote a book, actually, right here. Convenient. Taking America Back for God. This is a really, really useful book. And they talk about there being it's almost like a scale. You've got people who reject Christian nationalism, and you have people who are ambassadors. Then you have people who kind of fall in between, where they'll tolerate it to an extent. And those are the people who you're probably more likely to have interfaith dialogues with. Who are willing to maybe see like, oh yeah, actually you're right. When we say we should base our values on our laws on Christian values, what do you mean by that? Let's define that. Does that really support religious equality? And there are people who are more willing to have that conversation than someone who is like Christian nationalism all the way. And if you're not a Christian nationalist, you're un-American, get out. Like that's going to be a lot harder to have those conversations. So really think about who you're targeting there, I think is really important. And I think recognizing, especially with Christian nationalism, is that not all Christians are Christian nationalists. And weirdly, not all Christian nationalists are Christians. There are people of all faiths, including atheism, who support Christian nationalists. This is something that's actually really interesting and really shows just how ingrained it is when people who say, I don't believe in God, but I think that having undergone the pledge is important because people need a moral guideline. They have bought into this narrative because it's so ingrained that even though it harms them and promotes these stereotypes against them, they've still bought into it. Mm-hmm. So we need to recognize that these concepts are much more complex. It's not just conservative white evangelicals pushing Christian nationalism. Sure, they are some of the loudest ambassadors oftentimes, but there's actually a solid group of evangelicals who oppose it for various reasons. And those are people that you're like, hey, we should team up. We fundamentally disagree on religion, but we do agree that Christian nationalism is harmful to democracy. So let's focus on that agreement. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important if we want to protect democracy from Christian nationalism.
Yeah, that is the big enemy. And we've had this conversation on this show before, and Genevieve and I have been all over the board with it, but the progressive Christians and the non dogmatic Christians, if you will, have more in common with us as an atheist than mm-hmm. they do with the fundamentalist far right Christian nationalists. We have to help them see that. And first of all, I think they can't be afraid of the word atheist. And there we come back to that whole notion of language and terminology and words, and they do matter. And as an atheist, if you've run into people who don't think that you're marginalized with that term, remind them of this fact that was in one of your articles, Christina, and I've seen it before, but 7 states in this country still have in their state constitution law that you cannot run for public office if you're an atheist. Now, that's unconstitutional. You mentioned earlier, but think about what people in that state would do, and even the politicians, if that law said you can't do that if you're a Jew or black or gay or whatever other marginalized group there might be. They would trip all over themselves to change that law, yet they're not changing it for the word atheist. And so that in of itself shows that that's still a word that they don't see as equal to them in terms of being a good American, a God-fearing American, that phraseology again. So we have a lot of work to do. And if we're going to do it, we have to have these nuanced conversations. So, man, that's just where we are. And it's going to take a lot. It's going to take a while. It's going to take more people like Christina Lee doing this hard work. And it's just brilliant what you're doing. I'm such a fan of you. So,
thank you so much.
Yeah, I really am. And I'm really happy that we were able to connect and I was able to find out the work you're doing. I found it fascinating. I still do. And where do you go from here, Christina? Are you going to write a bunch of books? What's up?
Yeah, well, I mean, I just finished my dissertation, which was on how under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. And I have a few more articles coming out. I have one coming out actually this summer about how Christian nationalists were really behind adding in God We Trust to coins in the 1860s and how that they continue to use it. I do my book vision. I would love to do a book that looks at how Christian nationalism is ingrained in U.S. culture. One of the things I find really fascinating about Christian nationalism is if you look at early Christian nationalist discourse, they very much argue that the founding fathers made a mistake and they want to fix the founding error. And then at some point around the early 1900s, that narrative shifted to the founding fathers made us a Christian nation. We must return to that. And I want to figure out what happened to make that shift happen and how that shift really shapes public memory and contemporary politics. Because I don't think we can understand contemporary Christian nationalism without understanding the nostalgia they have for the 1800s and how that has really evolved, and how Christian nationalism is ingrained in U.S. culture, in ways that we don't tend to talk about, and I think it's important to. Yeah. So that's my book plan. Not anytime soon, because I'm starting a new job in the fall, so I got to get used to that first. But that hopefully I will let you know when it comes out.
Well, yes, please do. We want to. Where can people find you? Do you have a website? Do you have a link tree? Did we get that from you? Can we put it in the comments? I don't know. How do folks follow you?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I like I said, I'm switching schools right now, so I don't currently have a stable page that has my normal CV and stuff that I publish. I do have a Twitter, but I haven't used it much recently, so I need to kind of reestablish my my political or my social media presence. So let me I'll give you my Twitter handle, and you can share that on your social media if you would like to. I don't even know what it is because I've been on it for so long, and I got to get back into it. But right now, I do have a profile on Colorado State University's website that has links to several of my articles that I've published in the past. And then I'm going to be going to the University of South Dakota, so I will have a new profile up there, where I'll continually update my CV with new articles that I publish.
Okay, I think Bevan pulled some stuff off of that article or the stuff from Colorado State, but we're going. I want to have you on. Maybe we'll have a panel on Christian nationalism because we're going to have.
Love it.
We're going to have Andrew Seidel on with Catherine Stewart. You know who Catherine Stewart is?
Yep, read her book.
I figured we've been talking to her and Andrew about having them on jointly, and I think maybe we need to add you and just
love to be on it.
So yeah, we'll be in touch with that. But I think that would be a very important conversation, and Genevieve and I could just sit back and listen to you guys talk.
Sounds great.
So we'll definitely have that in the works. It'll be later in the year because Catherine's out of the country right now, and it's a bit early in the morning in UK for her to be on the show. But,
yeah,
so
fair.
We'll definitely have that back. Genevieve, any parting words for our guest or our people?
I think I have ranted as much as I need to on this, but I will just say that, Christina, it has been such a pleasure, and just like Dave was saying, the work that you're doing is so important, and you could not have picked a better thing to focus on, considering everything that we've seen in the last 24 hours to 48 hours to 5 years to 10 years to 50 to 200. It's an ongoing issue. So just thank you for your contribution to the conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Bevan said links to Christina's articles are in the show notes. So look for those, folks. Great reading, fascinating articles with lots of links to other fascinating articles. So excellent work, Christina. Again, it's been such a pleasure to have you on. I'm a huge fan of your work. Keep it up. Teach these students what they need to hear. You're doing great work. You're getting them at a very formative time in their life. And so what you're able to do is just really, really good. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And folks, thank you for tuning in tonight. For everyone in the chats, the callers, the supporters, we appreciate you being there. And that's our show for tonight.